Why would an ancient civilization carve a symbol of power on their temple walls? The question lingers like a whisper across the desert winds. As the blazing sun of Egypt casts golden light over the sands, the ruins of towering temples rise from the horizon like ancient giants. Their walls are covered in carvings, hieroglyphs, images of gods, rituals, and hidden among them, strange and powerful symbols that once carried the essence of life itself. To the modern eye, they might seem odd, even shocking, but to the ancient Egyptians, these were not crude markings. They were keys to survival, prosperity, and cosmic order. The Nile, the heartbeat of Egypt, flowed with both water and mystery. Every year its flood brought fertile soil and with it life. But the Egyptians did not see this as mere nature. They saw it as the embodiment of divine energy. To them, fertility, growth, and masculinity were not private matters. They were sacred forces on which their entire society depended. The pharaoh's power, the nation's prosperity, and even the journey of souls in the afterlife were tied to the idea of strength, virility, and rebirth. In the sacred city of Akhmim, the cult of the god Mim thrived. Mim was no ordinary deity. Always depicted with an erect form, a flail raised in one hand, and crowned with tall plumes, he represented the most primal and essential power, male potency and agricultural fertility. Every harvest season, his image would be carried out in processions, surrounded by offerings and rituals. Fields of grain and herds of cattle were blessed in his name. For the people, this was not taboo. It was a celebration of life's continuity. The Festival of Min. Imagine the blazing heat of the Egyptian summer. Villagers gather before a massive temple. Priests chant hymns, carrying images of Min on sacred boats. Dancers, both men and women, sing songs of fertility and rebirth. The air smells of incense, while the sound of drums echoes through the sandstone walls. A young farmer stands among the crowd. For him, this festival is not a spectacle, it is survival. The rains, the soil, the strength of men and women to bring life into the world all depend on Min's blessing. Without it, the Nile may not rise, the fields may not yield, and his family might starve. As the effigy of Min passes by, the farmer bows low, whispering a prayer. Grant us strength, grant us life. The image may shock the modern viewer, but to him it is sacred, it is hope. The myth of Osiris and Isis. Yet Min was not the only god tied to fertility and masculine symbolism. The tale of Osiris carried even greater weight. According to legend, Osiris, the god-king of Egypt, was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Seth. His body was scattered across the land, torn into pieces. Isis, his devoted wife, searched tirelessly, gathering the fragments of her beloved. But one part of him, the most crucial for regeneration, was lost to the Nile. Desperate, Isis crafted it anew with her magic, restoring Osiris to wholeness. In that act, life triumphed over death, and their union brought forth Horus, the falcon god destined to avenge his father. This myth was more than a story. It explained the cycles of the Nile, the death of crops in drought and their rebirth in the flood. The missing and magically restored organ of Osiris became a symbol of cosmic renewal. To carve it on temple walls was not obscenity, it was to proclaim life's eternal return. Symbols in stone. Carved into the limestone walls of temples, phallic shapes, obelisks, and erect forms were constant reminders of life's force. The obelisk itself, tall and piercing the sky, was a giant stone representation of power and virility dedicated to the sun god Ra. At sunrise, its shadow stretched across the temple courtyards, uniting heaven and earth. Archaeologists have found small amulets in the shape of fertility symbols worn by common people for protection and prosperity. Some carried them to ensure safe childbirth, others for strong harvests, and some simply to attract divine favor. In tombs, such charms were buried with the dead to ensure regeneration in the afterlife. Power and taboo. But why were these symbols hidden in plain sight? Why carve them so boldly on sacred walls? For the Egyptians, there was no separation between the sacred and the sensual, between body and cosmos. To them, life itself was divine, and the forces that created it were worthy of worship. What we might see as vulgar, they saw as the purest truth. Without fertility, there was no kingdom, no pharaoh, no future. Yet there was a duality. These images were powerful but also dangerous. Priests controlled access to the most sacred rites. Ordinary people could see the festivals, but the deeper rituals, the secret chants, the symbolic offerings, were guarded within the inner sanctums of temples. Power lay not only in the symbols, but in who was allowed to interpret them. A pharaoh's strength. For the pharaoh, masculinity was not merely personal, it was political. His ability to protect Egypt, to lead armies, to father heirs, was tied to his legitimacy. Statues often showed kings in poses of eternal youth and vigor. Even in death, their tombs were adorned with symbols of fertility, ensuring that their strength would carry them into eternity. In inscriptions, enemies were sometimes mocked by depicting them as emasculated, symbols of weakness and defeat. To be stripped of virility was to be stripped of power. In contrast, the pharaoh was always carved with perfect symmetry, eternal strength, and divine masculinity. Everyday life and fertility rituals. It wasn't only in temples and myths. In villages, simple rituals echoed the grander ones of the priesthood. Farmers sprinkled seeds on their fields with prayers to Min. Couples hoping for children made offerings at small shrines. Amulets shaped like protective gods hung from their necks or were placed under their beds. Fertility was never taken for granted. It was fought for, prayed for, and celebrated. In one surviving papyrus, spells are written to help barren couples conceive. They invoke gods of fertility, linking the human act of reproduction with cosmic creation itself. For the Egyptians, every act of life was a reflection of the divine order. As the desert night falls, the walls of Karnak and Luxor glow under torchlight. Shadows of carved figures dance across the stones. They tell us a story, not just of kings and battles, but of life itself. Fertility, strength, masculinity, these were not hidden truths, but the foundations of civilization. The question remains, why carve such symbols on temple walls? The answer is simple, because to them, these were not taboos. They were prayers in stone, eternal reminders of life's power and the God's eternal blessing. The torches flicker in the darkness of the temple, and the echo of chanting fills the hall. In these sacred spaces, the Egyptians believed that the very forces of the universe could be summoned, contained, and directed. The fertility rituals, the carvings on stone, and the hidden symbols were not simply art, they were spells written in permanence. To look at them was to step into a world where myth, power, and life itself merged. The secret rites of Min. The cult of Min was notorious for its boldness. During the grand festival, which marked the beginning of the harvest season, the high priest would lead a sacred procession. Statues of Min, gleaming with fresh paint and adorned with offerings, were carried through the city streets. Priests raised banners bearing symbols of fertility, while musicians filled the air with rhythm. The people erupted in song, dancing through the night. But what outsiders never saw were the hidden rituals inside the sanctuary. In the darkness, offerings of bread, beer, figs, and lettuce were placed before the god. Lettuce, curiously, was associated with virility, its tall stalks seen as symbolic of male potency. The priesthood whispered invocations, calling upon Min to bless the land and its people with strength. These private rites were sealed away, unseen by ordinary eyes. What mattered was the outcome: the Nile's rise, the fertility of the soil, and the promise of continuity. The power of obelisks. Outside the temples, towering obelisks pierced the sky. Carved from single blocks of stone, they symbolized strength, endurance, and eternal masculinity. Standing at the gateways of temples, they were aligned with the sun. At dawn, their sharp shadows stretched across the courtyards, linking earth to the heavens. For the Egyptians, these were not just monuments, they were cosmic markers, proof that humanity could channel divine energy into stone. The obelisk was a phallic symbol, yes, but also much more. It was the embodiment of light, order, and stability. When paired with carvings of Min or Osiris, it became a complete expression of life's eternal rhythm. Even today, these obelisks stand across the world, worn transported to Rome, Paris, London, and New York, silent reminders of a civilization that dared to carve power into eternity. Isis and the resurrection of Osiris. The myth of Osiris remained at the heart of Egyptian belief. Each year, dramatic rituals reenacted his death and resurrection. Priests would play the roles of Isis, Horus, and Osiris, performing a sacred drama that symbolized rebirth. In one ceremony, seeds were planted in a bed shaped like Osiris. As they sprouted, the people saw living proof of resurrection. This ritual was a powerful metaphor. Even in death, life returns. The phallic symbol of Osiris, reimagined and restored by Isis, became a representation of the regenerative force of nature itself. Carvings on temple walls showed Isis hovering over Osiris, wings spread wide, giving breath and life. To the Egyptians, this was not mere myth, it was the blueprint of existence. The assurance that even when all seemed lost, life would return stronger than before. The pharaoh as living symbol. Every pharaoh embodied these principles. His image carved into walls was always youthful, vigorous, and powerful. Weakness had no place in royal art. The king was eternal strength, both father and protector of the nation. When the pharaoh performed rituals at temples, he stood as the human embodiment of Min and Osiris. His actions were believed to ensure the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people. In reliefs, he is shown presenting offerings, striking enemies, or standing tall before the gods. Each gesture carried layers of meaning, dominance, virility, and continuity. Even in death, the pharaoh's tombs were filled with fertility symbols, amulets, carvings, and magical spells to guarantee that his vitality continued in the afterlife. Amulets and everyday protection. It wasn't just the rulers and priests who embraced these symbols. Ordinary people, too, carried amulets shaped like fertility signs. A young woman might wear one for protection during childbirth. A farmer might bury one in his field for a stronger harvest. A newlywed couple might place one under their bed, hoping to conceive. Papyrus scrolls with magical formulas included prayers to Min, Hathor, and other fertility deities. These texts connected the private world of families to the cosmic forces worshipped in grand temples. For Egyptians, daily life was never separate from the divine. Every active creation was part of the universe's eternal cycle. The duality of power. But power always came with danger. Just as fertility symbols could bring life, they could also curse. To deny a man his virility was to deny him his strength. In tomb inscriptions, enemies were sometimes mocked as impotent or infertile, humiliated in both life and death. This duality reflected the Egyptian worldview. Balance was everything. Just as day balanced night and life balanced death, masculine strength balanced feminine creativity. One could not exist without the other. To carve one without the other would be incomplete. Archaeologists and modern interpretations. When modern archaeologists first uncovered these carvings, many were shocked. Victorian scholars, bound by their own taboos, often downplayed or ignored the overt sexual symbols in Egyptian art. Some labeled them as indecent, failing to grasp their sacred meaning. But later generations began to understand. These were not vulgar decorations. They were essential parts of Egyptian spirituality. They told a story of survival, agriculture, human love, and divine creation. Today we can see them for what they were, expressions of a society unafraid to celebrate life in its most primal form. We tried to honor what these symbols mean today. For us, these symbols serve as a reminder. Civilizations rise and fall, but the forces of life, birth, death, renewal remained constant. The Egyptians carved them into stone because they wanted eternity. They believed that by inscribing these truths, they could keep the universe balanced forever. As we walk through the ruins of Luxor or gaze at the obelisks scattered across modern cities, we are connected to that ancient vision. Each carving, each symbol each ritual, was a declaration. Life will go on, eternal echoes. The desert is silent now. The temples stand as shadows of their former glory, but on their walls, the symbols remain. Min with his raised hand and flail, Osiris with his eternal rebirth, Isis spreading her wings, all carved into eternity. The question asked at the beginning echoes again. Why would an ancient civilization carve a symbol of power on their temple walls? The answer, after this journey, becomes clear, because those symbols were not just about masculinity or fertility or strength. They were about survival. They were about the very essence of existence. For the Egyptians, to carve life into stone was to ensure that it would never fade, that long after their bodies had turned to dust, the power of creation would live on. And so, as we gaze upon these ancient stones, we see not just art, not just myth, but a civilization's eternal hope, that life, in all its forms, will never die.